Your journey has been an interesting one up to here. You've questioned so much more than those around you. You've even questioned yourself as to how you could have grown into these thoughts. Am I crazy? When did I begin to think differently? Why do people in general appear so limited in their thought process? Rest assured, you are not alone. The world is slowly waking up to what you already know inside, yet can't quite verbalize. Welcome to the Spiritual Dope Podcast, the show that answers the questions you never even knew to ask, but needed the answers to. Questions about you, this world, the people in it. Most importantly, how do I proceed now moving forward? We don't claim to have all the answers, but we sure do love living in the question. Time for another hit of Spiritual Dope with your host, Brandon Henley. Let's get right into today's episode.
Hey, there's Spiritual Dope. Today we journey into the world of consciousness with a unique scholar, Dr. Jahan. Give me the last name.
Khamsehzadeh.
That's right. I didn't want to butcher it. His study ranges from philosophy to cosmology and even mathematics. He has a particularly deep connection with the world of psychedelics, both academically and experientially. Author of the Psilocybin Connection, he's a graduate of the Hakami Somatic Psychotherapy Program and a mentor at the Center for Consciousness Medicine. Now he guides people through transformative psilocybin ceremonies in Jamaica with Atman retreats, and is a content advisor for the Synthesis Psychedelic Guide training. If you haven't guessed it by now, you just tuned in. We're going to talk about psychedelics on this one. Jahan, thanks for being here today.
Looking very forward to this. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, look, man, I like to start this off with the whole idea that you and I we're all of us really were vessels for source energy, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You and I are going to have a conversation. It's going to be awesome. You and I will probably think we understand what we're saying to each other. That's our hope. That's what communication does. But then somebody else is going to be tuning in, right? And they're going to hear something totally different. And it's a message that they need to hear. It can only come from source through you to them in this moment. What's that message that's coming through you to them right now?
I love the context that you're setting. And so if we all source, one large consciousness, in many ways, this is all made up of imagination. And from that context, every moment is art. And so even though we're doing our best to describe and give form to truth, we're taking our artistic rendering of it. And just like any kind of musician or artist, they have their own intention for making it, but then the perceiver or viewer creates their own interpretation of that art. So same here. We're going to share our piece, our truth, doing the best job we can to share something ineffable. And then their consciousness will contextualize in whatever way they're needing. So I think that's very much a personal way that source is always interacting with itself.
Yeah, I love that. You're right? I think, whatever it is, we find whatever it is we're looking for, right? And consciousness helps to provide that for us.
Absolutely. So for me, it's a lot more fun and stylish and hold things with a lot less kind of gravity when we see every moment as an artistic expression, whether we're looking at, scientific knowledge, philosophy, and even psychedelic experiences. That's my sense is when I'm going in these states is that the larger consciousness is cultivating and creating kind of this masterpiece of experience that we're in. Not so different than like a musical composition. So it's a very kind of fun way to move into the conversation.
For sure. When did you feel like you might have started approaching your life in this way, like artistic manner, like consciously?
Yeah, totally. So he was reading the book, The Mission of Art by Alex Gray, who's probably the most well-known visionary artist. And I read that book at 18. 3 months before, I had a life-changing psilocybin mushroom experience. I was an atheist before that experience, and there's kind of contact and experience of coming one with God and realizing everything is love and, where everything's interconnected. And then a couple months later, I took this course called God, Mind, and Matter, and there was 2 texts for that class. One was Ken Wilber's A Brief History of Everything, and he would be one of the main philosophers I would follow. And then there was The Mission of Art by Alex Gray, and Ken Wilber had written the intro. And for those who aren't familiar with Alex Gray, he's this incredible visionary artist that there is layers of the human body, from the muscle system, the skeletal system, the nervous system, but then the energetic system, and his decades of building work of kind of bringing the visionary world of psychedelics, in manifested artistic form. And so I took his idea, why not approach every moment as just like an artistic kind of rendering of reality.
How's it been working out?
I fucking love it. It's a lot more fun. It's this reminds me of another line from Saul Williams, this incredible like hip hop artist and poet, and he says, "Threw away the pen and pad and simply became the poem." So it's I think it's very freeing, and even in a deep psychedelic state, this kind of larger consciousness said, primarily before anything else, you're an artist, and I think that's kind of universal. And after that, you're a scientist, and so. If everything's really made of creativity in one way, and we are all this one being having a large dream, and artistic identity is not a bad way to come into this.
No, for sure. I mean, the palette's there, right?
Nice.
and we can leverage it any way we'd like. What talk to me a little bit about like a massive mushroom experience, right? What do they call it? What does Terrence McKenna call it? The heroic dose. Right. Yeah. The heroic dose. And talk to me about like what's life for you before that heroic dose? Like who are you before that?
Yeah. I think he put that forward, and he's now for sure my favorite philosopher, because he felt people weren't taking enough to really understand the psilocybin experience, where people were taking normally like 1.5 grams recreationally, and they're like, wow, I've done mushrooms before. And so he kind of had just to point to a numeric dose that at some point you can cross the threshold and move into a reality where you're encountering a deeper intelligence that talks and relates to you, And so that's something within my own experience that's been life-changing, and many others, is the contact with a deeper kind of consciousness. And what's so huge is you move out of this paradigm of kind of materialism of everything's in my brain to, wow, there's another entity that I'm dialoguing with that is so beyond me. And that really kind of makes you question reality, kind of forces you into like a very much a more spiritual world that's very interrelational.
And that's after, like, that is the heroic dose. What about like, tell me a little bit about like who you were as you walked into that, right? Like, were you
that,
like
that concert before? Being? Yeah. I was very much focused on science and evolution. I had been an atheist for many years, 1,000 reasons why God doesn't exist. And so I was also in a very existential place of what's the point of my life, not seeing any kind of larger spiritual reality. I was in a lot of pain and depression because it's a very kind of gloomy worldview, and there's a lot of trauma earlier in life. And it's one of those things where nobody could have convinced me that God or spirituality really exists. It wasn't a rational process. My rationality was very strong and would have come at every argument. And so it was only kind of having this direct experience that first started with the stereotypical ego death of the felt sense of I'm about to die, which was, the kind of most fearful thing you could go through. But I was also very curious. And after a while of being in the state, I surrendered and let it happen. And then came a large expansion of my consciousness, became the huge sold out concert arena, and a voice arose and started talking to me, and it was familiar, but not my own. And my body was vibrating, like rejoicing almost orgasmically with love. And there was this felt sense of being eternal. And the voice said that love's the most important thing in the universe. After that, followed by learning, and everything's so insignificant compared to these two values. And so this 90-minute experience restructured the course of my entire life, pretty much overnight.
Wow. Yeah. Like, I mean, that's powerful. Seems like you had like, look, this kind of like teenage angst type of thing, right? Like, the life that kind of came before it, like you're just like literally, why bother? What's the point? Yeah, I'll eat a handful of these, whatever. Right. And then next thing you know, like, you're like, oh shit. You're turned on, right? And you're leaning into this space. So what happens after like this epiphany, right? You've now connected with, source. You've now connected, you've gone beyond, the self. And now you're like, trying to maintain it, trying to learn more about it. Talk to me about like what happens after this.
Yeah. So I've had 20 years now, and I kind of followed that path, and I spent almost my entire time studying consciousness, full-time academically, and outside of that, it became interested in all my readings and workshops, trainings, because I kind of followed what it said, first and foremost, be loving. After that, the second reason we're really alive is to keep learning. And so because psychedelics have become my field of study, pretty much everything I've learned up to this point has been really useful in this arena, learning how to traverse and kind of describe consciousness, because it's kind of like the largest context there is. That's that felt sense while you're in these states, is that everything's made up of consciousness. Everything is source, everything's divine in that way. And so it's made life very mysterious because of it's this unfolding creativity, like this artistic masterpiece that never stops evolving. There's still like this sense of awe and inspiration that's there, and a sense of meaning and kind of like a mission, so it's made life, it's not that life's not painful still, but it's made it a lot more meaningful and a little bit more enjoyable.
Yeah, no, I love that. Mm-hmm. Just trying to think it through, right? So, 20 years studying, that's what I was thinking. Like, all right, well, if we're kind of looking right now, that whole 20 years, a good portion of the studies have to be underground studies, right? We'll call it. How did you kind of like maintain that? How do you feel about like even where we are right now, and kind of where do you see this stuff going?
Yeah, no, great questions. And so definitely the above ground stuff was a lot more intellectual stuff. And even though there was like a lot of therapeutic trainings I took, but it was already clear, but about 7 or 8 years ago, kind of there was a massive decisive shift that I was like, the most important things I've learned have actually been on psychedelics. And I've had hundreds of journeys, and I'm not encouraging that. That's just my path to kind of as an explorer in this area. And all the probably, I don't know, maybe 1,000 books I had read and all those years of classes, they're amazing, but they're still coming from the mind of other humans, right? And there's a way that you can kind of connect with them, the larger mind. And so Terence McKenna, my favorite philosopher, has this line as, one person mind trying to get enlightened by another human is like one piece of sand trying to get enlightened by another piece of sand when there's the entire ocean. When we look at the evolution of these plants, some of these psilocybin seems to be like 70 million years old. And, the mycelial structure, the large body of the mushrooms interconnects the whole ecological system. I mean, we're connecting with something much vaster here, that's kind of universal. And so they become kind of my primary teachers, and so even in that space, humbly, I wanted to be a professor for like 15 years. And what actually came to be more effective was, well, since I learned so much from these substances, including these plants and fungi, why not at least create a container where other people can learn the same way I did? So it's actually like, instead of me being in the forefront, you're just kind of in the background and creating the right context and space for people to have these direct experiences, which ultimately I found so transformative.
And so you were able to do that, create the container, facilitate, by going to Jamaica, or you had to go to other countries in order to make this happen, right?
Yeah, Jamaica is the only place that it never became illegal, so we've been working over there, and I've worked with a variety of trainings, including within the Mazatec mushroom lineage, and the Mazatecs was the main kind of tribal lineage that kept psilocybin really alive that the West, kind of encountered, and how it got popularized in the 50s. And so there's been a lot of ways around to get trainings in a variety of different modalities, both kind of tribal, indigenous, and then also therapeutically.
Yeah. No, and that's awesome, right? I'm just, mentally I'm thinking here, like, most people kind of landlocked to the States, right? So seeing this kind of surge of the mushrooms, it's and in this light, to me, it's very, or even psychedelics, right? It's kind of like, it's very interesting. What's the approach like in other countries, right, to psychedelics versus what we experience here in the States?
So for those that aren't aware, the field is changing rapidly, faster than any of us could have imagined. It's a different conversation 7 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago. For example, we decriminalized it here in Oakland, also testified in court. And the people that fought to decriminalize it only started that movement like 3 or 4 months before. They didn't think it was going to pass, but it did because it had in Denver. So I think we're at a point where maybe 8 or 9 different cities are decriminalized in the U.S. We have all of Oregon, we have Denver. And so it's happening fast here, and there's been massive research happening here in the U.S. for the last 20 years. And research has started to sprung up in other countries, but those countries can also use our data, right? And so because the cultural change partly through the media, Michael Pollan's bestseller, How to Change Your Mind in 2018 was huge. Then his Netflix special, probably even bigger. And so there's been a lot of surprises, including Australia has now become the first country to legalize psilocybin mushrooms and MDMA for medical use. And that goes to effect July 1st this year. So even though it wasn't a part of their trajectory history, there wasn't like a huge movement and all this work being done. They can see all the science, they can see all the shifts, they can see how effective this is. And now they've cut to the front of the line,
Yeah.
So likely, and we're 2025 in the U.S. seems the trajectory for federal legalization. So it feels like a wildfire is just beginning to spread and just catching on, and probably going to move at an accelerating pace.
What do you think some of the dangers are that might impede that in the U.S.?
A positive is we have the 1960s to look back on, and that so much has happened already in culture because of it. And so Michael Pollan had a line in his bestseller that really stood at point to me about really kind of understanding what happened in the 60s. And he says, what other point in human history did the youth have such a searing rite of passage that the prior generation didn't understand, right? So in the West here, we had no cultural context for psychedelics really on the mass level. Religions couldn't really describe it. Science couldn't really describe it, right? And then the youth, for the most part, having these huge experiences causing changes in their political views and their spirituality. In the arts, you see this huge change from music and, all the aesthetics. I mean, the 1960s blew open a door of creativity and freedom in many ways. And that level of change was really rapid for the prior generation. And so they quickly moved to make them illegal. So taking that line, what's needed really and has been happening is a container, and a container both intellectually, emotionally, and physically. So when these substances, because they've been existing alongside humanity since the very beginning, and they have continued existing with tribes for millennia, in a tribal notion, these are held in ceremonies, right? And they're passed down lineages. And so when people are using these plants and fungi medicines, normally a grandfather's in the room and the father's in the room and the family's doing it together, right? There's a communal understanding and context for these. And there's a cosmology that holds it. And so that's starting to be built, right? And so Western psychotherapy has done a lot, and that's providing a lot of context, right? We're seeing they're coming in mostly to the West from a therapeutic setting of these are healing. They are healing, and they're much more. And because of that, they're going to be largely held in clinics. So now we have a structural and intellectual context for this. It's also coming in through ceremonies, right? So we have a more shamanic context some of us are holding. And some of us now also doing it in the recreational setting in large festivals like Burning Man, Lightning in a Bottle, where it's well known that people are going to take psychedelics. So there's an infrastructure to hold it. I mean, there's nonstop talks all day on psychedelics. It's part of the community. So you have all these harm reduction models. So we're coming in with a lot more experience, understanding, and infrastructure than prior generations. So what can throw this down is people taking it outside of those kind of contexts and containers, overdosing in the wrong situation. It's going to be probably one of the scariest things, or people crossing boundaries sexually in a psychotherapeutic setting, stuff that's already happening, but like things that give it a bad name, so it's like you're lighting this huge expansive bomb, an explosion of consciousness, and you need the right kind of container to hold that kind of expansive state.
Yeah, I mean, I think the line's always been set and setting, right? As that kind of developed. We talk about harm reduction models. I'm not familiar with that. Go ahead and share some of what that is.
Yeah, it's pretty much the necessary bare minimum, like don't cause harm. And it's been there's been organizations that really put forward, probably the most well-known is the Zendo. And it was a side project from MAPS, who's been really leading a lot of psychedelic research for the last 20 years. And so Zendo partly started at Burning Man, and it was just like, how do we create a 3-hour training for people to volunteer just to hold space for other people's psychedelic experiences where they're providing safety but creating no harm. So when you get trained for 3 hours, you're not in a place to really do therapy or guide work, but you're there to build a relational kind of holding for this person while they're going through a really intense journey and creating a safe setting. And so harm reduction models apply to psychedelics. They also apply to addictions. For example, like the abstinence model doesn't necessarily work in most places for many reasons, right? But how do you bring harm reduction to people's addictions? Because the point is not to cause harm. No, not to stop any particular practice. And so it's kind of a mentality and viewpoint, and it's the lowest bar. It's not like we're doing therapy necessarily. We're just creating a situation where people are actually just safe.
Is it wrong to call it like trip sitters?
Yeah, so that's kind of, I would put at the lowest bar, which is like when people ask me how do you recommend, at the lowest bar, have a sitter. Somebody's there to look over the situation, to make sure you're safe, that has like a lifeline to reality, that can, if you're freaking out, can help you or can call for help if needed. So that would be a sitter. And then you have like guides, therapists, people trained in lineages, shamanically. So at least you're a sitter, meaning like you're kind of like in a loving way babysitting, because this person could be in a very kind of childhood kind of state. Yeah. Right.
No, okay. I mean, that gives me kind of an understanding there, and I love the idea, right? We've got all these, like you said, I think leaning up into, the 50s and 60s, this stuff pops on the scene. Nobody knows what the hell's going on, but everybody's doing it. And so let's shut it down, right? It's causing massive mind shifts in consciousness, people's spirituality, and the way that they're seeing everything. And again, the old guard doesn't necessarily understand it, and they're not too cool with it happening, right? Totally. But moving forward, I've read, I listened to the Pollen book, and moving forward, we understand now, right? Like, we've got now, everybody in the 60s that went through it. They're like, hey, yeah, this intense stuff. And yes, we should have the structure. Yeah, we should have the context. Yeah, if you are going to do it recreationally, here's like a setting, right? Let's try and keep it in there. Overdosing in the wrong situation, I'm sure there's plenty of those out there. And I think that I'm starting to see some of that stuff in the news, just like more and more mention of psychedelics in the news now. Like somebody shrooming on a plane, right, and freaking out, right? Also, if it's a long trip, like literally if it's a long flight, it's not something that you want to be like, right? You're stuck, right, and you can't get off. So, stuff like that. What are some other? I think it's fairly obvious, like what wrong situations would be, but like. Again, how do we prevent? I think the thing in Michael Pollan's book is, and other people that I've seen out there right now, is like, we don't want some of the stupid shit to happen, right? Yeah. How do we work to limit that?
Yeah. Totally. So I think from where I am, a mature standpoint is not trying to control people, because that doesn't necessarily work. So what you can do next is inform them and educate them, right? And so I think that's like the next big thing right now for the psychedelic work, is just educating people on so many parts of this, right? You mentioned set and setting, which is huge. It's like creating the right kind of context in your mindset and in the environment. Letting you know about dosage and potency, and making sure this is safe. There's certain different medicines, not mushrooms, but other ones are now being laced with some stuff, so you make sure it's not something like fentanyl. They won't need to have, like, it'd be nice if they have some kind of map of these experiences. Before we got on, I know we'd mentioned Stanislav Grof. So there's people that spent decades studying these states of consciousness, and they've created models and maps that are very, very helpful. It's nice for them to know the range of experiences, because it could be so otherworldly, like no point of reference, so it could be really disorienting. Having somebody there to take care of them. And then some of the stuff I would like to also bring in is like the deep history with humanity. I mean, these are fucking ancient. They're huge. You know, my dissertation, doctoral work was on the evolution of humanity and psychedelics. So there's a lot of depth that helps bring understanding and reverence. So there's a lot just on this part of just spreading awareness. You know, there's the main thing that we really need to overcome in this is just the stigma, you know, from, for example, just large ignorance of like, just say no to drugs, which is like this just bland out like denial, like we're not even going to think about it, don't learn about it, just say no, which doesn't work really in any part of our lives, right? And this is like substances are so varied and so different. We don't group them like people schedule-y, you know, we scheduled psilocybin as a Schedule 1 substance, the same as heroin, and they're like worlds apart. And so education first and foremost. And then after that is, you know, be strategic about this. So willy-nilly on a plane might create a really difficult situation for everybody involved.
Yeah, that definitely causes a scene. You talked about like maps of like how would you map this out? Let's say somebody wants to, you know, go check out some maps. I was not aware of anything like that. Is that something that's out there?
Yeah, so there's just in regular psychology, there's a lot of models of development, you know, so we can look from Abraham Maslow, you know, all the way to Ken Wilber, who focused more on meditation, but he's been decades creating maps and structures and development of consciousness. And those in the psychedelic world, probably the most well-known is Stanislav Grof, and he's held space for about 50,000 people, both on LSD and holotropic breathworks. He saw reoccurring patterns, you know, and so he created what's calls the basic perinatal matrices, which is the BPMs. And it's 4 stages of the psychedelic experience. And it models a birth process where stage 1, people kind of feel and this archetypically shows itself in so many ways, but like there's the womb state where the baby's in the womb. That's stage 1. And you can have the sense of unity, connected to everything, being loved and cared for. Stage 2 is like the baby's in the womb and the contraction started, but the cervix isn't open, so there's no out. And the baby's feeling all this pressure from the environment. And this can translate to depression, to kind of hell, to kind of fire, to eternal stuckness. Stage 3 is like the cervix opens, and so the baby's able to move through the canal. And then psychedelic states is like empowerment, fire, animalistic. It can be very, very sexual. And then stage 4 is the rebirth. The baby gets out. He or she's made it alive. And this is kind of correlated with like enlightenment states, rebirth, new identity, new self in a new world. And the whole idea is like it's a microcosm of the macro, that everything's kind of holographic, that like this birth process really is a pattern that exists all throughout our lives on many layers. It's a death and rebirth. It's a death of an old self, like the baby in the womb has one identity, and the birth of a new one. And so that's one model. And without these things, it get really confusing, where people can move into hellish states and you think they're eternal and you're just stuck. And it's nice to realize, oh, this is just one state. Stay with it. Everything changes, you know, and then you can move into an empowerment state, maybe hopefully a rebirth, you know, quote unquote enlightenment state, where there's like an expansion of its sense of self and a crystallization of a new identity.
It all sounds so very familiar. All of it, right? Like even like you're saying, like getting stuck in like a hellish state or something like that, and realizing, you know, but even like kind of coming out of that, right? As empowering, right? Like, oh shit, you know, made it through it. Or, you know, again, I think the other line that you've got on your website is, you know, and it's a Stanislav Grof line, is psychedelics are to psychology as, you know, the microscope and telescope are to those fields of work. When you get in there and you're in there with your own mind, it's a different space and place. So very, very cool to understand that through a mapping sensation, right? Like if somebody's out there and they're doing it without a guide, and at least they have like these little bits and pieces that'll be the things that help you through those situations, totally. Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tell me about your book, man.
Yeah, it was the hardest and best thing I've done in many ways. I felt like I needed like a deep sense of a mission, and I had to complete it. And this one centered around an idea first put forward by Terence and Dennis McKenna, that it was perhaps our humanity's relationship with psilocybin mushrooms that actually catapulted human evolution to the consciousness we now have. And I came across that idea at 19 from his book, Food of the Gods. And I'd focus on evolution both in every level, collectively, biologically, psychologically, spiritually. And it was still the best idea I've ever come across. And so I did my doctoral work around it. The idea being simple, that consciousness expanding, obviously within humanity compared to the rest of the animals, was their consciousness expanding compounds in the environment. Well, psilocybin mushrooms grow on every continent, but Antarctica, as Paul Stamets, a great mycologist, notes, it's the most plentiful mushroom in the Africa savannas where he evolved. There's archaeological evidence in Africa of early mushroom use, and there's archaeological evidence of mushroom use throughout the world, but this is from primate kind of form. There's about 17 primates that eat mushrooms. And then when we see the studies now, and we see the impacts they have, the statistics, and let me just stop there and share what they are. 80% success rate for treatment-resistant depression, 80% success rate for near end-of-life anxiety, people that are going to die, but they have anxiety because of it. This helps them overcome that fear. 80% success rate for alcohol addiction and nicotine addiction, which is the highest we have. Also for OCD, and 65% of people in the right setting have classical mystical experience, right? So these are huge gains, including for psychological health and for creativity, empathy, tremendous amount of empowerment, so much. And so just seeing that we can do this and this is true for us now, wouldn't that be true for our ancestors? Well, probably, right? And so the idea of these grew regularly in the environment, and they don't have all these stigmas and laws and judgments, they would probably take them regularly as they found them and eventually developed into rituals, a higher level of mushroom use, going with the seasons and the seasons of the moon and so on. And so this idea was fascinating because it kind of fit in all the missing pieces I saw in human evolution. And in 20 years, I haven't found one single contradiction. I've had to defend this, and I just see the science continually compound to really bring supporting evidence. And so it does many things. It changes our view of human identity. It's concurrent with our views of how evolution takes place, through food and diet and environmental shifts. But also it kind of really legitimizes psychedelics, giving them as like, well, it's a big part of how we create and remain human through this symbiotic union. And that's how evolution moves forward. How could we ever make them wrong? And instead, now let's form our relationship to them intelligently and consciously, so it was my best way to help make sense of the world. And also, there's a lot of evidence that shows that it creates ecological awareness. It's the way the environment creates homeostasis in consciousness. There's a good book called Darwin's Pharmacy, written by Richard Doyle. He's a professor at Pennsylvania State University, and he read thousands of trip reports. And he said that the main psychedelic insight is that the participant realizes they're part of a vast interconnected living system, and they should be returned ecodelics. And so I think it has a lot to offer, also the ecological kind of development, evolution. Once you have this sense of interconnectedness and we're part of everything, then you start to care about animals, humans, plants, the entire ecosystem, so it can create a moral and value shift, so this was my way to contribute towards that movement.
And so your book covers that.
All of this, yeah. All of it. This is quite an amount of work in detail.
No doubt. So I love the idea too of the connection, right? I think there is a success in mystical experiences. Is that is that part of what contributes into, I think, this ecodelic space? Does that mystical experience part of what happens there?
Totally.
To say, hey, we're all one, and we need to take better care of, I've been so mean to this grass out here. I need to talk to it with love, right? Kind of thing.
It's beautiful. So honestly, that was the primary impulse for me doing this work, because that early mystical experience and many other follows have been the most important moments of my entire life, and have been more helpful than any book I've read, more than any relationships I've been in, even though I love people, more than any teacher I've had, has been these mystical experiences, because part of it is kind of letting you into the deep nature of yourself and reality. I mean, it's a game changer, right? And that sense of oneness, that sense of unity, which I think is at the core of the mystical experience, is like this underlying thing that shifts everything. If we are deeply connected, that we are everything at some deep level, then you start to care. And it feels good. to care, to have a loving sense with everything. Your sense of self and your emotional range expands. And so even though I got into it for the mysticism, what I found out was the bulk of the work was actually working people through their trauma, because that's what's holding them back. And so in the Western psychotherapy, we've really contextualized psychedelics as healing because people are in depression and anxiety and a lot of PTSD. And it's like, yes, it does that and so much more. But right now, that's the part of culture where we're really working in. It's a lot of trauma work.
Healing, getting people to kind of see beyond the hurt.
It's like, the grass is hurt and so is your friend over there, right? Like, and so
right.
Let's help both.
I think a challenge is, you talked a lot about having these mystical experiences. Can people have these mystical experiences similar to without the drugs, right? Like, or, and again, me saying drugs is like just a problem in the past, right? Like you talked about, like, say no to drugs, kids. It's not even a drug, right? Like it's something else that it's undergoing reclassification in the modern dialect, I guess, as it were, right? But I would say, with through the breath work, right? And again, Stanislav Grof, right? Like, you can't use LSD anymore. Okay, what am I going to do? And he's like, I'm going to go create, and here's another way we can get there. What's the challenge there? Like, have you personally, have you found that you're having or have had any other mystical experiences outside of ingesting something?
Yeah, quite a few. My sense for myself is these other mystical experiences became easier because of my psychedelic experiences. It's almost like because I had those points of references and my consciousness or egoic structure had to dissolve so many times, it's easier for that to happen, Sure. And so I think it does contribute. And there's good work done that people got into meditation, yoga in the 60s because they had these psychedelic experiences. They're like, well, let's make this a part of our regular life and other modalities. There's been periods I've gotten really into meditation where at one point I was doing 1 hour, then 2 hours, then 3 hours a day. And about like 100 days in of going in deep, there's a very similar shift that I had with mushrooms where I was like, oh my God, I feel like I'm about to die. This is really fucking scary. Stay with it. Fucking die.
Right.
This deep sense of like my whole body vibrating orgasmically in the sense of like God, like the classical, whoa, breakthrough. But the first thought that arose in that state was, wow, I've experienced this on psilocybin. But this just took me hundreds of hours. And that has its benefits. It gives you kind of like a mindfulness every day. It creates a sense of discipline. Like that's beautiful, But in the state shift, there's other ways. Tantra's also done, like, there's been sexual experiences that I've kind of done it. I remember once I said I love you to somebody and barriers broke down and like this deep sense of being enwrapped with God. I've had mystical experiences in dreams, So there's a lot of things that kind of dissolve our boundaries and get there. But they're hard to do on command, right? Like you're lucky if you get a few in your life, Like you're really lucky if you get 2 or 3. So that you can do it any afternoon. Maybe the 65% chance you can do it one afternoon and you create the right situation. That's kind of unlike anything
65.
Else.
It's like a good range.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You just look at the clinical studies. Yeah.
That's awesome. So success rates with alcohol and kind of getting past like addictions. What's classified as success in those?
Yeah, totally. So maybe first start with the disclaimer, like, the studies show like 80%. I've seen almost 90, but it's like the 80% overall. And so first and foremost, I want to say the hardest part of my work has been dealing with expectations because it's not 100%. And then people come in and like, why wasn't I one of those people, right? Or people come in like, well, I didn't have the mystical experience. It's like, so this isn't 100% for anybody. A lot of the sessions are very painful, right? Because you're dealing with trauma, right? Like to make it, sometimes it's just like, it's all love and the person changes. That happens. Other time you're dealing with the agony and trauma they've been holding in their body for a fucking lifetime and they have to digest that. And so I've seen some amazing stuff where somebody's coming in and they've been addicted. They can't stop drinking every day for like, say, 5 years, right? And it's freaking havoc in every part of their life. And they come in, and then this deep childhood painful trauma, normally stuff with parents or people around, comes in that they had no idea of, and then they have to process that deep pain for like 6 hours, like at the highest level of agony, right?
Yeah.
But it feels so right. And they didn't know that bubble of pain was there. And once it's processed, the desire to drink kind of just went away by itself because you're not running away from this pain. Right? Or there's been a lot of, some of the worst trauma, if not the worst, is early childhood sexual abuse. It's like 1 in 4 women,
Right.
1 in 6 men for child trauma. And that really kind of can mess up their sense of who they are, the self-esteem, their safety. They're betrayed by somebody close to them. And so that trauma can really lead into somebody into addiction, suicide, and so on. And so, Stanislav Grof that we just shared about, he says, psychedelics catalyze what he calls holotropic states of consciousness, states that organically move towards wholeness. So anything that's repressed is coming up to be integrated so you become more whole. So anything that's stuck down, sexual energy, pain, fear, or even pleasure, or even confidence, because the people weren't allowed to feel bold or big, whatever is there is coming up by itself to be integrated. So the wide spectrum's available. So whether that's hell or heaven, you don't know what you're going to get. But it's nice to be viewing it as you're coming to get medicine.
Right. And again, I think that's all part of set and setting, right? Like, I'm coming there for there's an intention, there's a purpose, there's I'm guessing that there's maybe some work that gets done ahead of time that we say, hey, we've talked, this is what we've discussed. This is what we're going to do. And the person comes with a structure, right, ahead of time. Whereas, the other way to go about it is kind of just have some of these and next thing you know, you're fucking on the floor crying. Right. But being able
on
to
that
have
note,
that
I would
structure
never, I would never hold space for somebody if we didn't set all this up ahead of time, because I'm putting myself and them at risk. Right. So just from a professional standpoint, all that's super needed because it's a risk to everybody involved, for sure.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, right? What are some warning signs? Somebody says, "Hey, I'm going to this retreat. I'm going to do that. I'm going to, we're holding, we're doing medicine, right? Okay, what does that mean? What should red flags be, and what should be some? It's okay to go ahead and do this flags."
Personally, I would. If this was me, I would look at the credentials of the facilitators, like how are they trained? And people can, make judgment on that of like, well, they're just trainings, but at least that signifies to me that they've spent, months, but hopefully years studying this modality. And so they have some kind of credential to show for it. Otherwise, this person, maybe they've tripped 12 times, or I had told them in a journey to go do this, or and maybe that's their life vision 20 years down the road, but not tomorrow, right? And so there's so many people that aren't well adapted, that they haven't done their own personal work. So how can you guide somebody to terrain that you haven't gone through, right? So they haven't done their personal work. They're coming in to be spiritual, prestige or power, money. It's we still live in contextually in a capitalistic system. So anytime there's money to be made, people are infiltrating, trying to find a way to do it. So the history of the person matters quite a bit. Their credibility matters quite a bit, So do they have any kind of trauma training? Because trauma is probably going to come up, right? And then not only do they have some kind of psychotherapeutic trauma training under their belt, are they like well versed in this modality? At the bottom of so much of the psychotherapeutic trauma work is this person safe, right? Like this person needs to ignite a deeper sense of safety with them in the room than if you're alone. If the presence of this person makes you feel unsafe, then you're going to close up and not be able to surrender to the journey. And the whole thing might be difficult or even more traumatic, right? And so it's nice to get a sense of the facilitators ahead of time. Do I feel safe with this person? And then there's this other part of the larger organization. What's their mission? Why are they doing this? Again, are they motivated by money, or do they want to create a space of healing?
I think that's all like awesome information, right? Because again, given how prevalent it is right now, notoriety, right? I mean, Aaron Rodgers, a football star, right? So, doing this stuff. And so, of course, that's getting a lot of attention. And all kinds of other people, and again, just bubbling up the way that it is. These are all things that so anybody listening in right now that's going to check any of this stuff out, I think this is all great information to look into. Don't just book like a one-way trip out to some place that is doing it because they are doing it without going to meet them before, and find yourself in some kind of a sex slave cult.
We're opening ourselves to like very emotionally vulnerable states, so go in knowing that, like go in like you're going to do a therapy session, like who's your therapist, like, that's a nice mentality instead of like, this is just a fun trip. Yeah.
Your primary focus is on psilocybin. I'm sure I'm botching that too. I always say mushrooms, but it's easier for me. Is it there? Are you LSD, DMT, peyote? Like, where's all this in the whole scheme of things?
I'm personally well versed in a lot of medicines, and I'm a proponent of a lot of medicines. I've chosen to focus on psilocybin, especially academically, for many reasons. One, to do a dissertation, it's a lot of in-depth work, and when I widened the scope at first to cover all psychedelics, it already took me like 5 years to do this project. It would have taken fucking like so much to cover the ground in depth in the way I wanted, right? And so psilocybin got me to get a hold on it, and I chose it for many reasons, because its role in early humanity I found fascinating. It's found all over the world. People can grow it themselves, so it's a lot more accessible. There's been a great amount of research in the last 20 years. It has a lot less stigma than like LSD. LSD I love a lot, and it's like a 12-hour trip. Right. So, and it's the most potent psychedelic by weight, LSD. So there was a lot of factors of why I focused on psilocybin. It was also the first psychedelic that really helped me heal. And I really trust it for so many reasons. Its role in nature, my personal experience, what I've seen over and over in other people. It's not fun necessarily, but people that tend to do it are generally, I'd say, more solid, more integrity, more healthy. Even we could look at the work of Paul Stamets, the mycologist. He's like, if you want to see the health of the environment, you check the mycelium and the fungus, because it's really interconnecting everything together. So there's a lot of reasons why, if I was going to point to one in terms of spirituality and healing, it's going to be that one. That being said, there's so many ways to study consciousness, and do it carefully. But, I do encourage exploration, when possible, done safely.
For sure. Now, listen, man, I really appreciate you being on today. Where can people go to find out more about you?
For sure. So my book's on all the platforms, The Psilocybin Connection. It's, you can find it on Amazon, and it's available also as an ebook, and it's an audiobook. So it's an Audible, on all the major platforms. My website is psychedelicEvolution.org. You're going to see more about my practice, my work, and retreats I'm doing. Find me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, first name, last name. I post a lot of content on this. I have a lot of other podcasts, for sure.
Awesome. Now, appreciate you being on. I almost forgot, man. That I always look at this podcasting in general, right? It's like, especially this one, spiritual speed dating, right? Somebody's tuning in, they're looking for the next spiritual speed date. It could be you. Let me ask you a question or two. You ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Spiritual Bachelor number 1. How has your training in physics and mathematics influenced your understanding of consciousness?
It's good. So I went into physics and mathematics to try to see the underpinnings of the universe. And after 3 years, a mushroom journey lovingly told me that if I continue down this road, it was going to be kind of like the death of my soul. And I saw that, but it said to study mysticism, and I was like, that's not a major or profession. And so that mushroom journey, years into my undergrad, made me shift to more directly study consciousness in a variety of settings. And so what it helped me see is really mathematics is just one layer of reality. So in many ways, I would say it's multifold. It's like one layer of consciousness is mathematics and physics, but it goes so much deeper, especially experientially.
I love it.
Yeah.
Spiritual Bachelor number 1, what is next on your research or exploration agenda?
Another book I've had on my mind now for a few years. The title might be Psychedelic America, and I'm going to wait to see till its legalization moves forward. So the current state of psychedelics, because likely there will be a psychedelic clinic in every town because it's the most effective form of therapy. Most therapists want to get trained on it. So every town that has a psychedelic therapeutic clinic, which is most, they'll probably use psychedelics, right? So they'll see the impact, but then I want to go into the deep history of psychedelics in America, North Central South America. Before the Europeans came about 500 years ago, there's about 70 million people living here, North Central and South America. And a lot of the evidence shows still deep psychedelic use. So even when the Crusaders came over here from the Vatican, they shared that the Aztecs were taking mushrooms in their political ceremonies, right? We see even the Mayans going back a few thousand years, that's over 200 different mushroom stones. And the Toltecs are also very well known. And we know more Native Americans up here in the Americas were also using like peyote, San Pedro. And so we had about 70 million people that probably had regular psychedelic use conversing with nature, and they had been here. It seems people came about 20,000 years ago. And all that culture was wiped away. It was the largest ethnocide / genocide in human history, where 93% of the population died, right? 93%. So about 60 million people died, largely through disease. The language was changed to English and Spanish. The religion's gone. All these practices gone. Right. And so it's kind of erased from human history in many ways. So I want to really pull back the pieces and show that psychedelic use has been part of a human culture here for tens of thousands of years, for millions of people, just fine,
right.
And so
right.
I think it's a nice model and helps people anchor in that this was a part of this land, kind of restructuring and shifting what it means to be American.
I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that. And thanks again so much for being on today, man.
Brett, awesome to be here on your spiritual speed dating, brother.
Really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Spiritual Dope Podcast. Stay connected with us directly through spiritualdope.co. You can also join the discussion on Facebook, Spiritual Dope, and Instagram at spiritual_dope. If you would like to speak with us, send us an email through brandon@spiritualdope.co. And as always, thank you for cultivating your mindset and creating a better reality. This concludes the most thought-provoking part of your day. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay fully up to date. Until next time, be kind to yourself and trust your intuition.